The snow had settled thick and pristine over St. Mary Mead on Christmas morning, transforming the village into something from a child's picture book. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her sitting-room window with her knitting forgotten in her lap, watched the early light catch the frost patterns on her window pane and reflected that Christmas had a way of bringing people together, sometimes more closely than they might wish. The invitation to Greystone Manor had arrived 3 days prior, written in Lady Pemberton's careful script. A small Christmas gathering, she had written, to welcome home Captain Michael Hartwell, her nephew, recently returned from service in Burma. Miss Marple had accepted, partly from neighbourly duty and partly from that gentle curiosity which had served her so well over the years. There had been something in Lady Pemberton's tone during their brief encounter at the post office, a brittleness beneath the festive chair, that suggested this homecoming carried complications. The gathering that afternoon proved as revealing as Miss Marple had anticipated. Greystone Manor, with its oak-panelled drawing room and cheerful fire, provided the perfect stage for observing the subtle dramas that unfolded whenever families reunited after long separations. Lady Pemberton, resplendent in burgundy silk, presided over the tea service with her usual efficiency, though Miss Marple noted how her hands trembled slightly when arranging the Christmas roses. Her husband, Colonel Pemberton, maintained his hearty military bearing, but there was something watchful in his eyes whenever they rested on his nephew. Captain Hartwell himself proved an interesting study. Tall and lean, with the weathered look of a man who had seen too much, he carried himself with the careful politeness of someone navigating uncertain social terrain. His uniform was impeccable, his manner charming, yet Miss Marple detected beneath his easy smile the particular tension of a man who knew he was being measured against expectations he might not meet. The other guests added their own notes to the afternoon's complex harmony. Dr. Morrison, the village physician, seemed unusually interested in the captain's health, asking pointed questions about tropical diseases and recovery. Miss Felicity Dane, Lady Pemberton's companion, hovered near the tea service with nervous efficiency, her pale eyes darting frequently toward the captain with an expression Miss Marple couldn't quite decipher. Most intriguingly, young Mr. James Pemberton, the colonel's son and heir, maintained a studied casualness around his cousin that suggested deeper currents beneath their surface cordiality. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple found herself noting the small discordances that others might miss. The way Lady Pemberton's smile faltered when the captain mentioned his plans to remain in the village, Dr. Morrison's sharp glance when someone mentioned the captain's war record, the manner in which Miss Dane's hand shook as she passed the captain his third cup of tea, and how he paused, almost imperceptibly, before accepting it. The conversation turned, as it often did in those post-war years, to memories and losses. The captain spoke briefly of fallen comrades, his voice carefully modulated, while the others listened with the particular attention, the living pay to those who have witnessed death. Miss Marple, knitting resumed, observed how each person processed these glimpses into the captain's wartime experience. Lady Pemberton with maternal concern, the colonel with professional assessment, young James with something that might have been envy or resentment. As evening approached and the guests began to take their leave, Captain Hartwell excused himself to rest before dinner, citing the lingering effects of his long journey home. Miss Marple, gathering her things, noticed how relieved the remaining family members seemed once he had gone upstairs. It was, she reflected, rather like watching people exhale after holding their breath. She was awakened before dawn by urgent knocking at her door. Dr. Morrison stood on her doorstep, his medical bag in hand, and his face grave. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I'm afraid there's been a tragedy at Greystone Manor. Captain Hartwell has died in his sleep. Lady Pemberton specifically asked that you come." The scene at the manor was one of carefully controlled chaos. Lady Pemberton sat rigid in the morning room, her face pale but composed, while the colonel paced before the fireplace with military precision. Miss Dane fluttered about with tea and sympathy, and young James stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered garden with an expression Miss Marple found difficult to read. "He simply didn't wake up," Dr. Morrison explained quietly. "No obvious signs of distress, though there was a faint, sweet odor in the room that I can't quite identify. I've sent for Inspector Slack from Much Benham, but between you and me, Miss Marple, I suspect this wasn't the peaceful death it appears to be." Miss Marple settled into the chair offered to her and began, almost unconsciously, to knit. Around her, the family of Greystone Manor continued their careful dance of grief and suspicion, unaware that every gesture, every glance, every carefully chosen word was being catalogued by a mind that understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden behind the most respectable facades. Inspector Slack arrived with the authoritative crunch of boots on snow, bringing with him that particular blend of officiousness and impatience that marked his approach to what he clearly considered routine matters. Miss Marple observed from her corner chair as he shed his coat with unnecessary vigor, already dismissing the gathered family's concerns with barely concealed irritation. "Now then," he announced, consulting his notebook with theatrical importance, "Dr. Morrison has explained the situation. War veteran, tropical service, weakened constitution. These things happen more often than people like to admit. Still, we must follow proper procedures." His tone suggested he considered such procedures largely ceremonial, a bureaucratic necessity rather than genuine investigation. Lady Pemberton rose with dignity intact, despite her obvious distress. "Inspector, I must tell you that something feels terribly wrong about Michael's death. He seemed perfectly well yesterday evening, perhaps tired from his journey, but certainly not ill." "Begging your pardon, my lady," Inspector Slack replied with that particular condescension he reserved for what he considered feminine hysteria. "But appearances can be deceiving. The rigors of military service in Burma, the climate, the diseases. There are numerous explanations for sudden death in returned soldiers." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she observed the family's reactions to this exchange. Colonel Pemberton maintained his rigid military bearing, but his eyes betrayed deep unease. Young James had positioned himself near the fireplace, ostensibly for warmth, though Miss Marple noted how this vantage point allowed him to observe everyone while keeping his own expression partially hidden. Miss Dane continued her nervous ministrations, offering unwanted tea and adjusting flowers that needed no adjustment. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Inspector, while the captain's military service may indeed be relevant, I should mention again that peculiar sweet odor I detected in his room. It's not something I've encountered in cases of natural death, and it had largely dissipated by the time I returned with my equipment. Probably cologne or aftershave," Inspector Slack dismissed with a wave. "Military men often use strong scents. Habit from the tropics, I'd imagine." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with that mild expression those who knew her had learned to recognize as significant. "How interesting that you should mention scents, Inspector. Yesterday afternoon, Captain Hartwell seemed particularly sensitive to odors. He commented most appreciatively on the aroma of his tea when Miss Dane served him, pausing to savor it quite carefully. Such attention to sensory details often indicates someone who has learned to be cautious about consumption." The room fell silent at this observation, and Miss Marple was gratified to see several meaningful glances exchanged. Miss Dane's face had gone quite pale, and she pressed her handkerchief to her lips as if fighting nausea. As Inspector Slack began his methodical examination of the captain's room, the news of the sudden death commenced its inevitable journey through St. Mary Mead. The village post office became an impromptu forum for speculation, with Mrs. Price Ridley, the postmistress, declaring it a shame, a real shame after all he'd been through. Her theory, voiced in conspiratorial whispers, centered on war-damaged nerves and tropical fevers. The vicar, during his morning rounds, attributed the death to God's mysterious ways. though he confided to his wife about a conversation with the captain that had seemed unusually troubled. Old Mr. Wither at the Blue Boar suggested heart trouble, adding with shrewd eyes that while Pembertons had weak hearts, Michael was Lady Pemberton's nephew, not the Colonel's blood relation. Miss Marple, making her own quiet rounds through the village, listened to theories ranging from lingering malaria to melancholy over a wartime romance. She noted how eagerly people embraced comfortable explanations, avoiding the more unsettling possibility that a healthy young man might have met an unnatural end within his own family circle. Returning to the manor, she paused on the staircase landing where Inspector Slack had grudgingly allowed her access. There, caught almost invisibly in the roughness of the banister wood, was a single thread of dark red. Burgundy, like Lady Pemberton's Christmas gown. It could have come from numerous sources in a house like Greystone, yet Miss Marple noted its position carefully. In the morning room, she found Miss Dane seated with a dampened handkerchief, trembling with more than grief. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling beside her, "how tiresome for you to be the one who discovered him. You must have been up quite early." "I'm always up early," Miss Dane replied quickly. "Lady Pemberton finds early tea soothing. I knocked 3 times, but heard nothing at all." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the tea service left for inspection. The cup with its faint rim, the plate with toast crumbs, the milk jug where a thin skin had formed. Notably absent was any sugar bowl. Perhaps the captain took none, or perhaps someone had removed it quite carefully, for reasons that would seem entirely reasonable if questioned. The morning was proving most illuminating, though Miss Marple suspected the true revelations lay ahead. Inspector Slack returned from his examination of Captain Hartwell's quarters with the satisfied air of a man whose initial assumptions had been conveniently confirmed. In his hand, he carried a small empty glass vial, which he presented to the assembled family with barely concealed triumph. "Found this on the bedside table," he announced, offering it to Dr. Morrison for inspection. "Empty, naturally, but retains a faint medicinal odor, undoubtedly some tonic for tropical ailments. Explains your mysterious sweet scent, Doctor." Dr. Morrison accepted the vial with obvious reluctance, his examination more thorough than the inspector's cursory glance had warranted. "The scent is present," he conceded carefully, "though rather different from what I detected in the room itself. That was more pronounced, more—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't challenge the inspector's preferred conclusion too directly. "More what?" Miss Marple inquired gently, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "More deliberate," Dr. Morrison replied after a moment's consideration, as if something had been carefully prepared rather than simply consumed. Inspector Slack dismissed this observation with characteristic impatience. "Doctors always complicate simple matters. Now then, let's have proper statements from everyone. Lady Pemberton, you mentioned the captain retired early. Did he appear unwell?" Lady Pemberton's composure remained intact, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her burgundy skirt. "Michael was tired from his journey, Inspector, but certainly not ill. He spoke enthusiastically about Christmas dinner and his plans for the new year." Her gaze flickered toward the dining room, where the captain's place-setting remained untouched, a silent testament to interrupted expectations. The questioning proceeded with methodical efficiency, each family member offering carefully measured responses. Colonel Pemberton spoke of his nephew's apparent good spirits and their discussion of future plans, though Miss Marple detected underlying tension in his military bearing. Young James provided perhaps the most revealing testimony, his tone curiously flat as he described his cousin's eagerness to discuss his war experiences. "Rather too eager, one might think," he added with studied casualness, as if he were trying to convince himself of something. Miss Dane's account of discovering the body proved particularly illuminating. Her distress seemed genuine, yet Miss Marple observed how her fingers repeatedly sought the tea service, touching and retreating from the various implements as if drawn by guilty fascination. "I always prepare the morning tea in the same order," Miss Dane explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lady Pemberton first, then the captain, then the colonel. When I knocked this morning and received no answer, I simply knew something was terribly wrong." Carter, the butler, presented a figure of impeccable propriety when summoned. His testimony regarding the previous evening's tray service was precise and unhurried, though Miss Marple noted the unusual chapping on his hands. Evidence of excessive washing that seemed inconsistent with normal household duties. "The captain thanked me most courteously," Carter reported, "and requested additional blankets. He mentioned that the cold affected him more severely since his tropical service." As the formal questioning concluded, Miss Marple found herself drawn to examine the dining room more carefully. The Christmas table remained set with meticulous attention to detail, silver gleaming and crystal sparkling in the winter light. Her attention lingered on the ornate sugar tongs resting in their crystal bowl on the sideboard, a detail that gained significance when contrasted with the notable absence of any sugar service on Miss Dane's morning tea tray. The afternoon brought additional revelations as Miss Marple engaged in seemingly casual conversation with various household members. Lady Pemberton, her guard lowered by grief and Miss Marple's grandmotherly manner, revealed that Michael had spoken extensively about his intention to sell his shares in the family textile mill. "He was quite determined about it," she confided, her voice carrying undertones of distress. "Said he needed the capital to start fresh, away from all the memories. Colonel Pemberton was rather upset by the notion." This financial element added another layer to the mystery, particularly when Miss Marple learned from Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, about the captain's foreign belongings. "Those boxes he brought back," Mrs. Finch explained with obvious disapproval, "filled with strange things that didn't belong in a proper English household. There was a sweetish smell about them, particularly that lacquered box on his chest of drawers. Made the whole room feel foreign." The most significant discovery came when young James offered to show Miss Marple the greenhouse, ostensibly to provide respite from the day's tragic events. The glass structure, heated despite the winter cold, contained an impressive collection of exotic plants that thrived in the artificial tropical atmosphere. James proved remarkably knowledgeable about botanical specimens, particularly those with medicinal properties. Miss Marple observed several varieties she recognized from her extensive reading, including oleander with its deceptively beautiful pink flowers and other plants known for their toxic qualities when improperly prepared. A small notebook lay open on the potting bench, its pages filled with detailed observations about plant properties and extraction methods. One recent entry, dated just 2 days prior, discussed the solubility of certain compounds in heated liquids and their effectiveness when masked by sweet substances. The handwriting matched the careful script on the plant identification labels throughout the greenhouse. "Your botanical research appears quite comprehensive," Miss Marple observed mildly, noting how James carefully locked the greenhouse door as they departed. "Father's old interest," James replied, perhaps too quickly. "Military doctors learn to improvise with local resources when proper medications aren't available." As evening approached and Inspector Slack prepared to depart with his preliminary conclusion of natural causes, Miss Marple settled into her corner chair to reflect on the day's accumulating evidence. The missing sugar bowl, the botanical specimens, the financial motives, Miss Dane's nervous behavior around medicines, and the careful timing of various household activities all suggested a far more complex narrative than the inspector's convenient explanation allowed. The sweet odor that had puzzled Dr. Morrison, the captain's particular sensitivity to scents, and the meticulous preparation evident in the greenhouse notes painted a picture of deliberate planning, rather than natural tragedy. Miss Marple's fingers worked steadily at her knitting as she considered how these seemingly disparate elements might weave together into a pattern of calculated murder, hidden behind the respectable facade of a grieving family's Christmas celebration. Inspector Slack departed Greystone Manor with the satisfied air of a man whose preliminary conclusions had been conveniently confirmed by circumstantial evidence. His focus had shifted decisively toward Miss Dane, whose nervous demeanor and access to the captain's tea service made her, in his estimation, the most logical suspect should further investigation prove necessary. The discovery of saccharine tablets in her work box, combined with her nursing background and obvious distress, provided what he considered a compelling foundation for future proceedings. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by the inspector's eagerness to embrace simple explanations for what appeared to be a far more complex situation. As she examined the morning tea service once more, her keen eyes detected details that had escaped official scrutiny. The cup bore a faint tackiness on its exterior rather than interior, suggesting something had been applied to the outside surface. More significantly, a tiny grain of white substance adhered to the underside of the tray's handle. Not sugar, as it failed to dissolve under breath, but something more deliberate and calculated. The afternoon brought an unexpected revelation that transformed the entire complexion of the case. Lady Pemberton, her composure finally cracking under the strain of accumulated secrets, summoned the family to reveal a discovery among her nephew's effects. The leather portfolio she produced contained correspondence with London solicitors that painted Captain Hartwell's final days in an entirely new light. Michael had been making arrangements to change his will, Lady Pemberton announced, her voice barely steady. These letters detail his intention to leave his considerable inheritance to various charitable organizations rather than to his family. The documents revealed the captain's growing disillusionment with what he termed the comfortable assumptions of those who remained safely at home while others fought and died. Colonel Pemberton's reaction was immediate and explosive. His military bearing could not disguise the shock and anger that transformed his features as he absorbed the implications of his nephew's betrayal. "Ungrateful boy," he declared with barely controlled fury. "After everything we've sacrificed to maintain the family's position, to throw it all away on strangers and causes." Young James's response proved more measured but equally revealing. "The war changed him more than we realized," he observed with careful neutrality, though Miss Marple detected undertones of something deeper than mere disappointment. His scientific detachment when discussing his cousin's death now appeared in a different context, particularly when considered alongside his extensive botanical knowledge and the meticulous notes she had observed in the greenhouse. The financial motive that emerged from these revelations provided compelling reason for murder, yet Miss Marple remained skeptical of the obvious conclusions. While the colonel's anger was genuine and his motive clear, his character suggested a man more likely to confront problems directly than resort to subtle poisoning. The careful preparation evident in the captain's death required a different temperament entirely. Village gossip, meanwhile, had seized upon the colonel as the most likely culprit. Mrs. Price Ridley at the post office declared it perfectly understandable, really when you consider what the family stood to lose. The Blue Boar's patrons nodded sagely over their pints, agreeing that military men knew about such things from their service in foreign places. This convenient explanation satisfied the community's need for closure while providing Inspector Slack with a backup theory should his case against Miss Dane falter. Miss Marple, however, found herself drawn repeatedly to smaller details that others overlooked. The burgundy thread caught on the banister's rough wood suggested someone in Lady Pemberton's Christmas gown had passed that way in haste, yet the positioning indicated movement upward rather than down. Carter's unusually chapped hands spoke of excessive washing, while his precise testimony about encountering James near the greenhouse after midnight raised questions about timing and opportunity. Most significantly, the missing sugar bowl that had prompted Miss Dane's late-night kitchen visit remained unaccounted for. Elsie's testimony about fresh sugar being prepared specifically for the captain's morning tea, combined with the absence of any sugar service on the discovered tray, suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous action. Dr. Morrison's continued unease about the empty vial's contents added another layer of complexity. His inability to identify the substance, despite his extensive medical knowledge, implied something more sophisticated than common household poisons. When James volunteered his services to analyze the mysterious compound, Miss Marple noted the offer with particular interest, considering his demonstrated expertise in botanical chemistry and extraction processes. As evening approached and the family retreated to their private griefs and calculations, Miss Marple settled by the fire with her knitting, her mind working to weave together the accumulating threads of evidence. The pattern was becoming clearer, a carefully orchestrated deception that used obvious suspects to mask a more subtle and dangerous truth. The sweet odor that had puzzled Dr. Morrison, the meticulous timing of various household activities, and the sophisticated knowledge required for the crime all pointed towards someone whose guilt lay hidden behind a facade of helpful cooperation and scientific expertise. The obvious suspect was indeed too obvious, a carefully constructed misdirection designed to protect the true perpetrator, who moved through the investigation with calculated innocence, offering assistance while systematically eliminating evidence of their own involvement. The morning after Inspector Slack's departure brought Miss Marple to the servants' quarters of Greystone Manor, where she found Elsie scrubbing the captain's breakfast tray with unusual vigor. The young maid looked up with red-rimmed eyes, her movements betraying the nervous energy that follows a sleepless night spent replaying terrible events. "You're up early, my dear," Miss Marple observed gently, settling herself on a kitchen chair with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to extracting confidences through kindness rather than interrogation. "Mr. Carter said everything must be spotless for when the inspector returns." Elsie whispered, her scrubbing intensifying. "He was most particular about this tray, said there was a sticky ring where the cup had sat, and it needed proper attention." Her voice dropped further as she added, "Strange thing, though. The stickiness was on the outside of the cup, not the inside where you'd expect from spilled tea." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. "And the sugar service, dear. I noticed there wasn't any on the tray when poor Captain Hartwell was discovered." Elsie's face brightened slightly at this safer topic. "Oh, that was sorted the night before. Miss Dane had me fill the blue willow sugar bowl with fresh lumps. The captain was most particular about his sugar, you see. Brought his own supply from Burma, he did. Kept it in that fancy lacquered box in his room. Said English sugar was too coarse after years of the refined Eastern variety." This revelation sent Miss Marple's mind racing along new pathways of possibility. A personal sugar supply, carefully guarded and specifically requested, provided the perfect vehicle for poisoning, particularly if someone with botanical knowledge understood how to disguise toxic substances within sweet, crystalline compounds. Her subsequent examination of the pantry revealed the blue willow sugar bowl inverted on the highest shelf, its position suggesting hasty concealment rather than careful storage. When she lifted the bowl, a faint but distinctly artificial sweetness rose from its interior. Not the clean scent of pure sugar, but something more complex and deliberately crafted. A pale ring marked the wooden shelf where moisture had pooled, evidence of recent washing that had been thorough but not quite complete. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, proved invaluable in reconstructing the captain's final evening. "Most particular about his bedtime routine he was," she explained while arranging fresh flowers in the morning room. "Always took his own sugar in a small bowl to his room for his morning tea. Said it was a habit. From his military service. Never knew when you might need your own supplies. Miss Dane would prepare it special each evening, using the sugar from his lacquered box." The implications crystallized with startling clarity. Someone had contaminated the captain's personal sugar supply, knowing that his morning tea ritual would provide the perfect delivery mechanism. The sticky residue on the exterior of his cup suggested the substance had been applied to the sugar lumps themselves, dissolving slowly to coat the cup's surface as the hot tea was poured. Young James's reaction to these discoveries proved particularly illuminating. When Miss Marple mentioned her interest in the blue willow bowl during afternoon tea, his scientific curiosity seemed genuine, yet she detected the particular tension of someone whose expertise was being scrutinized too closely. His offer to analyze any mysterious substances using his greenhouse equipment raised immediate questions about his true motivations, particularly given the sophisticated botanical knowledge evident in his research notes. Fascinating how certain compounds can be masked by sweetness, James observed with studied casualness. The tropical plants often develop the most interesting chemical properties, nature's way of protecting valuable resources from those who might misuse them. His words carried an undercurrent that Miss Marple found deeply troubling, suggesting familiarity with exactly the kind of botanical chemistry that could transform innocent sugar into a deadly trap. The financial motive revealed through the captain's correspondence provided compelling reason for murder, yet Miss Marple recognized that monetary concerns alone rarely drove individuals to such elaborate crimes. The careful planning evident in the poisoning method, the sophisticated knowledge required, and the psychological manipulation involved suggested someone motivated by deeper resentments, perhaps the particular bitterness of a young man who felt his scientific talents undervalued while his cousin received praise for mere military service. Dr. Morrison's continued unease about the case found validation in these developments. When Miss Marple shared her discoveries privately, his medical training allowed him to recognize the sophistication involved. Whoever did this possessed considerable knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology, he observed grimly. They understood not only how to create an effective poison, but how to ensure its consumption without arousing suspicion until far too late. Village speculation, meanwhile, had shifted predictably toward Colonel Pemberton following revelations about the inheritance. The comfortable assumption that military experience explained knowledge of exotic poisons satisfied most residents' need for closure, while providing Inspector Slack with a theory that required minimal investigation beyond obvious motives and opportunity. Miss Marple found this rush to judgment deeply troubling, recognizing how dangerous it was to allow obvious suspects to obscure more complex truths. Her afternoon walk through St. Mary Mead provided additional insights as villagers shared their theories and observations. Mrs. Bantry mentioned seeing lights in the Manor's greenhouse at unusual hours during recent weeks, while the postman recalled delivering several packages containing what appeared to be botanical specimens, all addressed to young James rather than his father, the Colonel. The most revealing moment came when Miss Marple, with characteristic gentleness, requested tea served in the blue willow sugar bowl. The ripple of reactions across the assembled family was immediate and telling. Lady Pemberton's involuntary glance toward the pantry, Carter's fractional pause as he recalculated some internal arrangement, and most significantly, James's hand whitening as it gripped his chair back with barely controlled tension. "I'm afraid that particular bowl is still drying from its cleaning," Carter replied with practiced smoothness, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice. Perhaps the cut-glass service would be more suitable. "How thoughtful," Miss Marple replied mildly, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Though I've always been particularly fond of the blue willow pattern. Perhaps when it's properly dry." The silence that followed her gentle insistence was profound and revealing. In that measured pause, Miss Marple observed the careful calculations occurring behind each pair of eyes, the assessment of risk, the weighing of responses, and most tellingly, the particular desperation of someone whose carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel under the pressure of seemingly innocent requests. As evening approached and the family dispersed to their private concerns, Miss Marple settled by the fire with her knitting, her mind working to weave together the accumulating evidence. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear, a sophisticated crime hidden behind helpful cooperation and scientific expertise, designed to cast suspicion on obvious targets while the true perpetrator moved through the investigation with calculated innocence. The blue willow sugar bowl, with its telltale residue and suspicious absence, held the key to exposing a murderer whose greatest weapon was the very knowledge that made him appear most helpful in solving the crime he had committed. The morning after Miss Marple's pointed inquiry about the blue willow sugar bowl brought a palpable tension to Greystone Manor's servants' quarters. Carter moved through his duties with the rigid precision of a man fighting to maintain composure, though Miss Marple noted how his hands trembled slightly as he arranged the breakfast service. When she approached him in the pantry with her characteristic gentleness, his carefully constructed facade began to show cracks. "The sugar bowl has been thoroughly cleaned, I trust?" Miss Marple inquired mildly, observing how Carter's knuckles whitened as he gripped the silver tray. "Yes, Miss Marple," Carter replied, his voice carefully modulated. "Mr. James specifically requested that I attend to it personally. He noticed some stickiness around the rim that might attract insects." The explanation came too quickly, rehearsed rather than natural. "How thoughtful of Mr. James to notice such details," Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "Though insects in December seem rather unlikely, don't you think?" Carter's face flushed, and he busied himself unnecessarily with already spotless silverware. Miss Marple noted the pronounced chapping on his hands. Not the ordinary redness from household cleaning, but the particular irritation that came from handling harsh chemicals or botanical extracts. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a disturbing pattern. Her subsequent examination of the captain's room with Dr. Morrison revealed additional troubling details. The lacquered box that had contained the captain's personal sugar supply sat precisely where it should, yet something about its positioning seemed deliberately arranged. When Dr. Morrison lifted the lid with his handkerchief, Miss Marple observed the sugar within, fine, irregular lumps that appeared normal until examined more closely. Several pieces bore a faint, artificial gloss, as though they had been handled while damp or treated with some foreign substance. The captain was most particular about his sugar, Elsie confirmed when summoned to provide testimony. Always said 2 lumps were sufficient, and anything more was vulgar. Miss Dane prepared his evening tray, special-like, using the sugar from his own box. He never trusted the household supply after his time in Burma. Said you learned to be careful about what you consumed in foreign places. This revelation struck Miss Marple with particular force. A man cautious about foreign substances, relying on his own carefully guarded supply, would be vulnerable only if someone contaminated that very source of security. The irony was both tragic and telling. The captain's protective habits had been turned against him by someone who understood his routines intimately. Young James's reaction to these discoveries proved increasingly illuminating. When Miss Marple encountered him in the greenhouse that afternoon, his scientific enthusiasm seemed genuine, yet she detected underlying currents of defensiveness. His botanical knowledge was indeed impressive, particularly his understanding of how certain compounds could be extracted and refined. The notebook on his potting bench contained detailed observations about plant alkaloids and their solubility in various mediums, information that would prove invaluable to someone seeking to disguise poison within sweet substances. "Your research appears quite comprehensive," Miss Marple observed, noting a recent entry about masking bitter compounds with crystalline carriers. Such dedication to scientific inquiry must require considerable late-night work. James's smile appeared too quickly, too practiced. "One finds the quiet hours most conducive to concentration. The greenhouse provides perfect conditions for delicate work. Controlled temperature, privacy, and access to specialized equipment." His words carried undertones that suggested he understood exactly how his nocturnal activities might appear to suspicious minds. The afternoon brought additional revelations that transformed the case's complexion entirely. Lady Pemberton, her composure finally cracking under accumulated strain, revealed the true extent of Captain Hartwell's plans for his inheritance. Beyond merely selling his shares in the family textile mill, He had discovered irregularities in wartime contracts that suggested profiteering and had intended to expose these activities to the authorities. "Michael saw everything in absolutes," Lady Pemberton explained, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "He couldn't understand the compromises necessary for survival during wartime, the gray areas that sometimes separate success from failure. His moral certainty threatened to destroy everything our family had worked to build." Colonel Pemberton's reaction was immediate and explosive. His military bearing couldn't disguise the fury that transformed his features as he absorbed the implications of his nephew's intended betrayal. "Ungrateful boy," he declared with barely contained rage. "After everything we sacrificed to maintain the family's position, to throw it all away on principles and causes." Miss Marple observed these family dynamics with growing understanding. The financial motive was compelling, yet she recognized that money alone rarely drove individuals to such elaborate crimes. The careful planning evident in the poisoning method, the sophisticated knowledge required, and the psychological manipulation involved suggested someone motivated by deeper resentments. Perhaps the particular bitterness of intellectual pride wounded by perceived slights. Dr. Morrison's continued unease about the case found validation in these developments. His medical training allowed him to recognize the sophistication involved in the crime, far beyond simple household poisoning. Whoever did this possessed considerable knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology, he observed grimly. They understood not only how to create an effective poison, but how to ensure its consumption without arousing suspicion. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself drawn repeatedly to the greenhouse, where James continued his botanical work with suspicious dedication. The controlled environment, the specialized equipment, and the detailed research notes all pointed towards someone capable of extracting and refining toxic compounds from exotic plants. Most significantly, his intimate knowledge of the household, routines, combined with his access to the captain's personal belongings, provided both opportunity and means for the sophisticated crime. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear, though Miss Marple recognized the danger of premature conclusions. The obvious suspect might indeed be guilty, yet her experience had taught her to look beyond surface appearances, toward deeper truth. The missing sugar bowl, the cleaned evidence, and the careful timing of various discoveries all suggested a methodical mind at work, someone who understood how to manipulate both physical evidence and human psychology to achieve their desired outcome. Village speculation, meanwhile, had begun to focus on the financial motives revealed through the inheritance dispute. The comfortable assumption that family greed explained the crime satisfied most residents' need for closure, while providing Inspector Slack with theories that required minimal investigation beyond obvious motives and opportunity. Miss Marple settled by the fire with her knitting, her mind working to weave together the accumulating threads of evidence. The blue willow sugar bowl, with its suspicious cleanliness and missing contents, remained central to exposing a crime that grew more complex with each revelation. The true challenge lay not in identifying the obvious suspect, but in determining whether appearances masked an even more dangerous truth hidden within the respectable facade of Greystone Manor's Christmas tragedy. The evening brought an unexpected gathering in Greystone Manor's drawing room, as if the accumulated tensions of the day had drawn the family together by some invisible force. Snow continued to press against the tall windows, and the fire crackled with unusual vigor, casting dancing shadows that seemed to emphasize the unease beneath the surface of polite conversation. Miss Marple had been persuaded to remain for evening cocoa, ostensibly due to the treacherous condition of the lanes, though she suspected her presence served to steady nerves that were fraying in ways the family preferred not to acknowledge. Carter entered with his customary precision, bearing a silver tray arranged with 6 delicate porcelain cups. The service was impeccable, each piece positioned with military exactness, though Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in his movements as he arranged the settings. Miss Dane followed with the accompaniments, her hands trembling slightly as she carried the sugar service. Not the blue willow bowl, but the cut glass substitute that had appeared with suspicious convenience. I thought, given the circumstances, we might avoid anything too reminiscent of recent events, Miss Dane murmured, her voice barely audible as she avoided Lady Pemberton's questioning gaze. Quite sensible, Colonel Pemberton replied with forced heartiness, though his military bearing couldn't disguise the underlying strain. Plain cocoa, nothing elaborate. As Carter began pouring the rich, dark liquid, James drifted closer with that casual air that appears natural only when carefully rehearsed. "Allow me to assist, Mother," he said pleasantly, lifting the cut glass sugar bowl with practiced ease. "A little sweetness helps with the bitterness, don't you think?" Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm while her observant eyes catalogued seemingly insignificant details. One cup bore a hairline crack in its glaze that caught the firelight. Another sat fractionally askew on its saucer, as if placed in haste. Most significantly, she noted how James's attention focused on the specific arrangement of cups, his scientific mind apparently categorizing and organizing even this simple domestic ritual. Lady Pemberton reached for her customary cup, but James's hand intercepted the movement with filial solicitude. "This one's warmer, Mother," he explained, exchanging her selection with another cup positioned near the hearth. He added 2 sugar lumps with a deft manipulation of the silver tongs, stirring with thorough precision before presenting the cup with apparent devotion. The young man then selected a cup for himself, adding a single lump of sugar with deliberate care. As he raised the cup to his lips, Miss Marple observed the subtle calculation in his expression, the look of someone conducting a carefully controlled experiment. He took a measured sip, and his face immediately transformed with apparent alarm. "Something's wrong," he declared, his voice hoarse with what appeared to be genuine distress. The cup clattered against its saucer as he set it down with shaking hands. "Bitter. There's something terribly bitter." He swayed slightly, one hand pressed to his throat in a gesture of obvious discomfort. Dr. Morrison, who had arrived earlier to check on Lady Pemberton's nerves following the day's revelations, immediately moved to James's assistance. His medical training asserted itself as he examined the young man's pupils and felt his pulse, his movements swift and professional. The doctor lifted the abandoned cup and inhaled carefully, detecting that familiar sweet undertone overlaid with something more acrid and deliberately medicinal. "Rapid pulse, but regular," Dr. Morrison murmured, his examination thorough despite the apparent urgency. "No burning sensation in the throat, I assume. Any nausea?" James nodded weakly, his performance convincing enough to alarm his family while remaining within safe physiological parameters. Miss Marple noted the particular care with which he displayed his symptoms, dramatic enough to create concern, yet controlled enough to avoid genuine danger. "Ipecac," Dr. Morrison said quietly, almost to himself, recognizing the distinctive effects of the powerful emetic, or something very similar. The diagnosis sent ripples of fresh panic through the assembled family. Colonel Pemberton's fury found immediate focus as he turned toward Miss Dane with accusations forming on his lips, while Lady Pemberton pressed her handkerchief to her mouth in horror. The comfortable assumption that the companions' access to the tea service explained both incidents satisfied their need for a convenient culprit. Miss Marple, however, observed details that others missed in their alarm. James's right cuff bore a damp patch that spoke of recently spilled liquid, while his handkerchief carried a sharp herbal scent that competed uneasily with the cocoa's rich aroma. Her extensive knowledge of household remedies gained through years of village life allowed her to recognize the particular odor of ipecac, a substance that could produce impressive symptoms with minimal actual danger when administered by someone with sufficient botanical knowledge. The commotion that followed provided perfect cover for other activities. During the confusion of summoning Inspector Slack and attending to James's theatrical distress, Elsie appeared at Miss Marple's elbow with disturbing news. The young maid had been sent upstairs to tidy the captain's room and discovered that his lacquered box now stood empty. Its remaining sugar contents vanished entirely. Several letters from his correspondence with London solicitors had also disappeared, removed with surgical precision during the downstairs drama. As Inspector Slack arrived with his characteristic bluster and immediately focused on Miss Dane as the obvious suspect, Miss Marple settled deeper into her corner chair, her knitting needles working steadily. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear, a sophisticated performance designed to eliminate remaining evidence while casting suspicion on the most vulnerable member of the household. The true perpetrator had demonstrated remarkable psychological insight, understanding exactly how to manipulate both physical evidence and human emotions to achieve their desired outcome. The evening's events represented not another attempted murder, but a carefully orchestrated misdirection that revealed the killer's growing desperation as Miss Marple's gentle inquiries drew closer to the truth hidden within Greystone Manor's respectable facade. Inspector Slack's departure, with Miss Dane in tow, left Greystone Manor shrouded in an uneasy quiet that seemed to press against the snow-covered windows like an unwelcome visitor. James, having recovered with remarkable speed from his supposed poisoning, moved through the house with the careful efficiency of someone attending to urgent but unspoken tasks. Miss Marple observed from her corner chair as he made several trips to various rooms, ostensibly checking on family members, but actually, she suspected, ensuring that certain evidence had been properly disposed of. Dr. Morrison lingered after the inspector's departure, his medical conscience troubled by details that didn't align with his professional experience. When Miss Marple approached him quietly in the library, his whispered observations proved illuminating. The symptoms were consistent with ipecac poisoning, he confirmed, yet I detected no actual traces of the substance on his breath or clothing. Most peculiar for someone who claimed to have consumed a contaminated beverage. The recovery was also unusually rapid. Genuine ipecac produces more prolonged gastric distress. This confirmation of her suspicions sent Miss Marple on a careful tour of the house's key locations. In the captain's room, she found the lacquered box not merely empty but thoroughly cleaned, its interior bearing the telltale scent of vinegar and washing soda. The correspondence with London solicitors had vanished entirely, removed with surgical precision during the evening's theatrical chaos. Most tellingly, the greenhouse showed signs of recent and thorough cleaning, with several bottles and implements conspicuously absent from their previous positions. Carter, when approached with Miss Marple's characteristic gentleness, proved unable to maintain his facade of ignorance. "Mr. James instructed me to clean everything most thoroughly," he admitted quietly, his chapped hands testimony to harsh chemicals and urgent scrubbing. "Said there might be contamination that could harm the family. Provided the washing crystals himself, from his greenhouse supplies." The systematic elimination of evidence painted a clear picture of desperate efficiency, yet Miss Marple recognized that physical proof alone would not suffice to expose a killer this methodical. What was needed was a psychological revelation that would strip away the careful mask of innocence and reveal the calculating intelligence beneath. Her opportunity came as the family gathered for what Lady Pemberton hoped would be a restorative evening tea. James positioned himself near the fireplace with studied casualness, his demeanor that of a concerned family member rather than a suspect under scrutiny. Miss Marple settled into her chair and began what appeared to be idle conversation about village matters. "Such interesting work you do in the greenhouse, James," she observed mildly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "It reminds me of old Mr. Hartwell's prize orchids. He was your grandfather's brother, wasn't he? Such a methodical man, always experimenting with different compounds to enhance his blooms. He once told me that the most effective treatments were often the most subtle ones, designed to work slowly and leave no obvious traces." James's smile remained perfectly composed, though Miss Marple noted the slight stiffening of his shoulders. "Grandfather's brother was indeed a dedicated botanist," Such precision requires considerable knowledge of plant chemistry and extraction methods." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "I imagine someone with your scientific background would appreciate the elegance of such methods. The way certain compounds can be masked within sweet substances, for instance, or how timing can be calculated to achieve maximum effect while minimizing suspicion." The room fell silent, except for the gentle clicking of Miss Marple's needles. James' carefully maintained composure flickered almost imperceptibly, a shadow of something calculating and dangerous crossing his features before being quickly suppressed. "Your botanical research must require considerable late-night work," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Elsie mentioned seeing lights in the greenhouse at unusual hours. Such dedication to scientific advancement is admirable, particularly when one considers how certain plant alkaloids require precise timing for proper extraction and refinement." James's hands, which had been resting casually on his chair arms, now gripped the upholstery with barely controlled tension. His voice, when he replied, carried an edge that hadn't been present moments before. "Scientific research demands precision, Miss Marple. Every variable must be controlled, every element properly prepared. Those who lack such understanding often misinterpret legitimate work." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with that deceptively mild expression that those who knew her had learned to recognize as significant. "How true, dear boy. Though I've always found it fascinating how the most dangerous knowledge often belongs to those who appear most helpful in solving the very problems they've created. Rather like a doctor who poisons his patients and then offers to treat the symptoms." The psychological test had achieved its purpose. James' mask slipped entirely, revealing the cold intelligence and barely controlled fury beneath his facade of concerned family member. His reaction, the sudden rigidity, the flash of calculation in his eyes, the defensive hostility that replaced his previous charm, told Miss Marple everything she needed to know about the true identity of Captain Hartwell's killer. The stage was set for the final, devastating revelation that would expose how scientific knowledge and family resentment had combined to create the perfect murder, hidden behind the respectable facade of Christmas grief and botanical research. The silence that followed Miss Marple's pointed observation stretched through the drawing room like a taut wire, each tick of the mantel clock marking moments heavy with unspoken truths. James remained frozen in his chair, his scientific composure warring with primitive instincts of flight and concealment. Lady Pemberton sensed the shift in atmosphere without understanding its source, her maternal intuition detecting danger while her conscious mind refused to acknowledge its nature. Miss Marple excused herself briefly, returning within minutes with cheeks pinked by the cold and an unusually purposeful air about her movements. Dr. Morrison, whom she had quietly detained, settled into the armchair nearest the fire with the calm of a man prepared to witness something significant. When Carter appeared with the evening tea service, Miss Marple had resumed her corner seat, her knitting folded with uncharacteristic neatness. "If it is not too much trouble, Carter," Miss Marple said with gentle authority, "I have developed quite a fondness for the blue willow sugar bowl. There is something comforting about familiar patterns, don't you think?" Carter's hesitation was barely perceptible, his eyes darting to James before returning to Miss Marple's expectant gaze. "The blue willow bowl is not quite dry from its cleaning, Miss Marple. Perhaps the cut glass service would be more suitable." "How thoughtful you are," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, "though I do so prefer the blue willow, and I've been such a terrible magpie today." From her reticule, she produced a small tissue containing 2 sugar lumps. "I found these caught in the wicker of poor Captain Hartwell's breakfast tray yesterday. Such waste, if they're perfectly clean." The effect was immediate and electric. James's hand, reaching for the teapot, froze in mid-air before he recovered with apparent nonchalance. "I shouldn't think it wise to use anything that might be contaminated," he said smoothly, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned practicality. Dr. Morrison leaned forward with professional interest. They appear perfectly ordinary to me. No harm if Miss Marple wishes them for her tea." "Just half a lump will suffice," Miss Marple said comfortably, settling her shoulders as if anticipating a pleasant treat. James moved to assist, his movements betraying the calculated precision of someone conducting a carefully controlled experiment. When he reached for the fresh sugar, Miss Marple's gentle voice interrupted his motion. "The little ones from the tissue, dear boy. My old teeth don't take kindly to the larger lumps." James's smile flickered almost imperceptibly as he lifted one of the preserved sugar lumps with the silver tongs. His hesitation was fractional but telling, the pause of someone calculating risks and consequences. When he moved to exchange Miss Marple's cup with his own, ostensibly for convenience, she intercepted the gesture with grandmotherly firmness. "How considerate you are," Miss Marple observed mildly, watching the sugar dissolve in her tea. "One always notes such kindness in young people. I was particularly struck by your care with Captain Hartwell's cocoa last evening, so thoughtful to remember that he always took exactly 2 lumps of sugar." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Speaking of last evening, the symptoms you displayed were indeed consistent with ipecac poisoning, James. Yet I detected no actual traces of the substance on your breath or clothing. Most curious for someone who claimed to have consumed a contaminated beverage." The medical observation struck James like a physical blow. His carefully constructed performance had been designed to eliminate suspicion while providing cover for evidence removal, yet Dr. Morrison's professional expertise had detected the deception. The young man's scientific pride warred visibly with his survival instinct. "You're suggesting I somehow poisoned myself?" James demanded, his cultured voice rising with apparent indignation. "That's absurd beyond comprehension." Miss Marple looked up from her untouched tea with that deceptively mild expression that masked razor-sharp perception. "Not poisoned, dear boy. Merely created the appearance of poisoning using your extensive botanical knowledge. A few drops of ipecac concentrate, carefully applied to achieve the desired symptoms without genuine danger, rather like a controlled laboratory experiment." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. James's facade cracked entirely, revealing the calculating intelligence that had orchestrated murder while maintaining helpful cooperation. His response carried the particular venom of intellectual pride, wounded by exposure. "Michael was going to destroy everything," he snarled, his mask finally slipping completely. "His precious principles would have ruined generations of family achievement while I remained invisible. My contributions ignored in favor of his manufactured heroism. A clerk who filed reports in Burma, celebrated as a war hero, while my botanical research, genuine scientific advancement, was dismissed as mere hobby." The confession emerged with the force of long-suppressed resentment, revealing the psychological foundation that had transformed scientific knowledge into an instrument of murder. Lady Pemberton's horrified gasp echoed through the room as the full implications settled over the family like a shroud. Miss Marple set down her teacup with quiet finality. "The sugar was indeed ingenious, James. Contaminating his personal supply ensured consumption while avoiding suspicion, particularly given his cautious nature. The sticky residue on the cup's exterior confirmed the poison was embedded within the sugar lumps themselves. The stage was set for the complete revelation that would expose how intellectual pride and family resentment had combined to create the perfect murder, hidden behind the respectable facade of Christmas grief and scientific research. The silence that followed James's bitter outburst stretched through the drawing room like a taut wire, each family member processing the implications of his partial confession. Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care, her mild expression masking the steel beneath as she prepared to unravel the complete truth that lay hidden beneath layers of scientific sophistication and family betrayal. "The contaminated sugar was indeed ingenious," Miss Marple observed with quiet authority, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Though I suspect the true complexity lay not merely in the method, but in the psychological sophistication required to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. You understood, James, that Captain Hartwell's death alone would not suffice. You needed to ensure that suspicion fell elsewhere while you remained above reproach. James's eyes glittered with the dangerous light of cornered intelligence, yet his scientific pride compelled him to engage with someone who appreciated the elegance of his achievement. Michael's moral crusade would have destroyed everything, he declared with bitter precision, his cultured voice distorting under the pressure of long-suppressed resentment. His precious principles would have exposed wartime contracts that kept this family solvent, while he played hero in Burma, filing reports and taking credit for other men's sacrifices. Yet financial considerations alone seem insufficient to explain such meticulous planning. Miss Marple continued gently, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. The greenhouse notes, the careful timing of evidence removal, the theatrical performance with the ipecac. These suggest motivations that run far deeper than monetary concerns. The observation struck its target with devastating accuracy. James's composure cracked further, revealing the wounded intellectual pride that had festered beneath his helpful exterior for years. "You want to understand the true injustice?" he snarled, abandoning all pretense of civilized discourse. Michael was a glorified clerk who processed supply requisitions, yet everyone celebrated him as a war hero, while my genuine scientific achievements were dismissed as mere hobbies. Botanical chemistry that could revolutionize medicine, extraction techniques that surpass anything in current literature, all ignored in favor of his manufactured heroism. Miss Marple nodded with the understanding of someone who had observed human nature's darker complexities throughout her long life. The method you employed demonstrated remarkable sophistication. You extracted digitalis compounds from your greenhouse foxgloves, concentrating and refining them through distillation processes that required weeks of careful preparation. The sugar lumps in Captain Hartwell's personal supply were impregnated using a solution that dried clear but retained lethal potency when dissolved in heated liquid. Dr. Morrison leaned forward with professional fascination despite his moral horror. "The sweet odor I detected in the captain's room, that was your masking agent." "Artificial vanilla extract, combined with trace amounts of bitter almond essence," James replied with perverse pride in his technical mastery. The combination created a pleasant scent that would seem natural while effectively disguising any medicinal odors from the digitalis compounds. The sticky residue on the exterior of his teacup resulted from the poison coating the cup's surface as the contaminated sugar dissolved in the hot tea. Lady Pemberton's horrified gasp punctuated the clinical explanation, yet James continued with the compulsive honesty of someone finally unburdening years of calculated deception. "The irony was perfect, using my despised botanical knowledge to eliminate the golden boy whose very existence diminished my accomplishments. Every technique I employed represented genuine scientific advancement, yet it would never receive recognition because its application served justice rather than academic glory. The complete revelation exposed not merely a murderer, but a mind that had perverted genuine scientific knowledge into an instrument of calculated destruction. His botanical expertise, combined with intimate knowledge of household routines and family psychology, had created what he considered the perfect crime. Murder disguised as natural death, with carefully prepared scapegoats to bear responsibility. The theatrical poisoning last evening served multiple purposes, Miss Marple observed with quiet certainty. It provided cover for eliminating remaining evidence while casting suspicion on Miss Dane, whose access to the tea service and nervous disposition made her an ideal scapegoat. The ipecac symptoms were carefully calculated to appear genuine while avoiding actual danger to yourself. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor as Inspector Slack's voice preceded his entrance, carrying news that would transform the investigation's trajectory. "What's all this commotion?" he demanded, entering with ruddy cheeks and obvious irritation. I've just received word from Much Benham. Miss Dane's alibi is rather stronger than we initially thought. She was at the vicarage for the crucial period, which rather eliminates her from consideration. Then you'll need to listen carefully, Dr. Morrison said with clinical authority, because Miss Marple has identified the actual perpetrator and method. James's gaze moved toward the door with the calculation of someone assessing escape routes, but Colonel Pemberton stepped forward with the steady authority of a military man who recognized defeat when he saw it. "No," he said quietly, placing a restraining hand on his son's shoulder. "You will not run from this." For a heartbeat, James seemed about to strike his father, then something older than intellect. Perhaps exhaustion or the sudden recognition that his precise calculations had reached their inevitable conclusion dulled the fury in his eyes. He gave a thin smile that carried echoes of the brilliant child who had once sought approval through academic achievement. "You never saw me," he said to his father with curious softness. "You never recognized that intelligence might breed resentment rather than gratitude. That capability without recognition becomes a poison more deadly than anything extracted from greenhouse flowers." Lady Pemberton's cry carried the hollow anguish of maternal grief for a child lost long before this moment of final revelation. Carter bowed his head in shame, his chapped hands testimony to his complicity in the systematic destruction of evidence. Miss Dane, pale and shaken in the doorway where Inspector Slack's sergeant had brought her, swayed with the relief of someone whose nightmare had finally ended. As Inspector Slack moved to complete the formal arrest, James paused beside Miss Marple's chair with the remnants of scientific curiosity. "You were certain from the beginning," he observed. "No," she replied with kindly honesty, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "Only from the moment you staged your own poisoning. Men who are genuinely ill rarely possess the presence of mind to orchestrate their own rescue while simultaneously eliminating evidence." The snow continued its relentless assault against the windows as James departed between two policemen, leaving behind a family forever changed by the revelation that intellectual brilliance, when twisted by resentment and wounded pride, could create horrors far more devastating than simple passion or greed. Miss Marple reflected that human nature, in all its complexity, rarely announced itself with fanfare. It emerged through small habits, daily choices, and the particular poison that grew from a brilliant mind, convinced that the world had failed to recognize its true worth. The Christmas tragedy at Greystone Manor stood complete, not as a crime of sudden passion, but as the calculated product of years of accumulated bitterness, transformed through scientific knowledge into an instrument of family destruction that would echo through generations yet to come. The heavy silence that settled over Greystone Manor following James's departure carried the weight of shattered assumptions and broken trust. Lady Pemberton remained motionless in her chair, her burgundy dress a stark reminder of the thread that had first caught Miss Marple's attention on the staircase banister. The maternal pride that had once celebrated her son's intellectual achievements now recoiled from the knowledge that those very gifts had been perverted into instruments of calculated murder. Colonel Pemberton stood by the morning-room window, his military bearing intact, yet somehow diminished by the recognition that his failure to acknowledge James's contributions had fostered the resentment that ultimately destroyed their family. Dr. Morrison, making his final examination of the evidence, found himself deeply troubled by the sophistication of the crime he had helped expose. The botanical chemistry involved was genuinely impressive. James possessed knowledge that could have revolutionized medical treatment, yet he had chosen to apply his expertise toward destruction rather than healing. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting with characteristic deliberation, took one final look at the blue willow sugar bowl that had played such a crucial role in the investigation. The vessel sat innocently on the tea service, thoroughly cleaned yet forever marked by its part in delivering death through sweetness. The irony was complete. Something designed to enhance life's pleasures had been perverted into an instrument of calculated destruction. The method was indeed elegant in its simplicity. Miss Marple observed to Dr. Morrison as they examined James's greenhouse notes one final time. Digitalis compounds extracted from the foxgloves, concentrated through weeks of patient distillation, then carefully applied to selected sugar lumps in the captain's personal supply. The artificial vanilla and bitter almond essence masked any medicinal odors while creating that sweet scent you detected in his room. The systematic destruction of evidence revealed a mind that understood not merely chemistry and botany, but human psychology and investigative procedures. James had anticipated potential scrutiny and prepared accordingly, using his helpful cooperation during the investigation to eliminate traces of his involvement while guiding suspicion toward more obvious targets. Carter's chapped hands bore witness to the harsh cleaning chemicals James had provided, ostensibly to protect the family from contamination. As news of the arrest spread through St. Mary Mead, the village's comfortable assumptions about the nature of evil underwent profound revision. Mrs. Price Ridley at the post office could only manage a stunned, "Well, I never did," while the Blue Boar's patrons shook their heads over their pints, agreeing that book learning without proper moral guidance could lead to terrible consequences. The notion that such calculated malice could emerge from their own respectable community challenged everything they thought they knew about human nature. Miss Marple walked slowly through the snow-covered lanes, reflecting on the particular tragedy of intellectual gifts corrupted by wounded pride and resentment. This was not a crime of sudden passion or simple greed, but murder born of a slow-burning sense of injustice. James had seen his cousin Michael as an undeserving recipient of praise and affection, a manufactured hero whose moral uprightness threatened to expose the family's wartime compromises while overshadowing his own deeply valued, though unacknowledged, talents. The precision that had marked James's approach, the meticulous planning, the careful timing, the theatrical misdirection, spoke of a mind that reveled in intellectual mastery. Yet that very cleverness, the desire to demonstrate his superiority, had ultimately betrayed him. He had sought to control every variable but failed to account for the unpredictable element of human observation, particularly that of a seemingly innocuous elderly lady from St. Mary Mead. Inspector Slack's final report would detail the physical evidence, the contaminated sugar lumps, the greenhouse extraction equipment, the systematic elimination of incriminating materials. Yet Miss Marple understood that the true explanation lay deeper in the psychology of a brilliant mind that had turned its gifts toward destruction when recognition failed to materialize on its own terms. Village life would gradually resume its normal rhythms, though the memory of this Christmas tragedy would linger as a quiet warning. The comfortable certainties about respectability and education had been shaken by the recognition that evil could flourish even in the most cultivated circumstances. Greystone Manor would bear invisible scars for generations, its festive traditions forever shadowed by the knowledge of what had transpired within its walls. Settling by her cottage fire with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the universal patterns she had observed throughout her long experience with human nature. The envy that could transform into bitterness, the pride that could twist into malice, the way seemingly ordinary people could harbor extraordinary darkness. These were themes that repeated themselves across countless villages and countless lives. The human heart, she mused, was far more intricate and dangerous than any greenhouse, capable of cultivating both exquisite beauty and deadly poison. Yet there remained hope in the gentle art of observation, in the patient work of understanding, and in the quiet courage required to speak truth when comfortable lies would be easier to accept. Outside her window, children tested the frozen pond with tentative steps, their laughter carrying thinly through the winter air. The ice held because they tested it carefully, noting cracks before they could spread and cause catastrophe. In villages, Miss Marple thought, safety often depended on such vigilance, testing gently, noticing small warnings, refusing grand gestures in favor of small certainties that preserved what mattered most. The Christmas night when a soldier didn't wake again would be remembered not as a tragic accident, but as a reminder that the most dangerous secrets often hide behind the most respectable facades, and that human nature's capacity for both creation and destruction remains forever intertwined in the complex garden of the human soul.